They moved into their grandmother's old house to start a new life, but every night there was the smell of freshly baked pie in the kitchen. The problem is that Grandma died 3 years ago. This story isn't fiction. It's about a memory that doesn't die. Subscribe. Comment where you're watching from. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. It clung to the windshield like a thick veil, making the world beyond the glass feel blurry and unreachable. The wipers groaned back and forth with mechanical fatigue, pushing away droplets that reappeared instantly. Inside the car, silence reigned, heavy and close, interrupted only by the dull hum of tires on wet asphalt. Robert Miller kept both hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Beside him, in the passenger seat, his son sat with a backpack hugged to his chest, earbuds in, head turned toward the window, where rows of empty cornfields blurred into gray. It was late afternoon when they pulled into the narrow gravel driveway. The house stood at the end, hunched against the weather like an old animal waiting for the storm to pass. White paint had peeled from its wooden siding, and the shutters hung askew like tired eyelids. The porch sagged slightly at one corner, and the swing where someone once rocked in summer evenings groaned with every gust of wind. This had been Edith's house for almost 5 decades. Now it belonged to no one, and nothing except time. Robert turned off the engine but didn't reach for the door. He looked at the house for a moment, then glanced sideways at his son. Zachary had already pulled out one earbud and was looking at the porch with a distant expression. Neither of them spoke. The moment felt like a pause, not in conversation, but in life itself. They entered without ceremony. Robert had brought the key weeks earlier when the legal formalities were finally settled. The air inside was musty and dense with the scent of paper, wood, and lavender long faded into dust. Zachary stepped in slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The living room looked almost exactly as he remembered it from summers past, though the colors seemed duller now, like photographs left too long in the sun. There was the old fireplace, its bricks darkened by years of smoke. There was the oval rug that always curled at one corner no matter how many times Edith straightened it. There was her favorite armchair, draped in a crocheted blanket, facing the window where light no longer poured in like it used to. Everything was still in its place, as though she might walk in from the kitchen with a tray of cookies and scold them for tracking in mud. But she wouldn't. Not anymore. They moved through the house with the awkwardness of strangers stepping into memory. Upstairs, Zachary found his old room unchanged. His bunk bed still stood beneath the sloped ceiling. The bookshelf still held dusty paperbacks and a jar of marbles. It was too small for him now. He set his backpack on the floor and opened the window. Outside, the wind rustled the tall grass in the backyard, bending it in slow waves. At the edge of the property, the apple tree leaned slightly, as if bowing under the weight of absence. Later, Robert called from downstairs, his voice muffled and flat. Zachary didn't answer right away. He sat on the bed, running his fingers over the quilted bedspread his grandmother had sewn when he was 6. The stitching was coming loose in places, but he remembered every pattern. They ate takeout at the kitchen table without speaking. Robert scrolled through emails on his phone, muttering about rescheduling meetings and how fast the market was moving. He mentioned a real estate agent in town who could come by that week, and how they'd need to declutter the place before listing it. Zachary didn't look up. He stirred the noodles in his container, barely tasting them. The kitchen felt wrong without the low murmur of a radio playing classical music, without the smell of cinnamon and clove, without the warm clink of teacups and the sound of a woman humming quietly, as she moved from counter to oven. Without her. The night passed slowly. Zachary lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as wind brushed branches against the window pane. He could hear his father moving around downstairs, the creak of old boards, the occasional sigh. At some point, he fell asleep, but it was not a restful sleep. He dreamed of warm hands on his forehead, of pies cooling on the windowsill, of laughter echoing through the house like birdsong. He woke suddenly, just before dawn. At first, he didn't understand what had roused him. The air was still and the house was silent. But then he smelled it. Faint, but unmistakable. Cinnamon, apples, butter, the scent of his grandmother's famous apple pie. Zachary sat up slowly. The scent was strong, as though the pie had just come out of the oven. He blinked, thinking it had to be a dream. He pulled on a sweatshirt and padded quietly downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The oven was cold. The counters were bare, untouched. But the scent was real. So real it made his mouth water, so real it ached. He checked the trash, the sink, the pantry. No signs of cooking. No apples, no flour, no cinnamon. Nothing. And yet the scent hung in the air like a memory too stubborn to fade. Robert was still asleep, his door closed. Zachary stood in the center of the kitchen, turning slowly. He went to the oven, touching the top with cautious fingers. It was cool, but the pie tin that always hung above the stove, a dented silver thing with scalloped edges, was missing. He looked around, checked the drawers, the lower cabinets. Then he saw it. Sitting on the stovetop, pristine and empty, was the tin, warm to the touch. A shiver ran down his spine. He backed away and sat at the table, the old wooden surface smooth beneath his palms. He pressed his hands flat against it, trying to make sense of what he was feeling. He wasn't scared, not exactly. It was something else. Like he had been noticed. Like the house had recognized him and had decided to greet him the only way it knew how. Later that morning, he said nothing to his father. He watched as Robert gulped down coffee and read a message from the realtor. They were on a tight timeline, he said. Clean the place up, list it, sell it, move on. Zachary just nodded. He kept thinking about the scent, about the tin, about the way the oven had felt, about the way the house had breathed around him. That night, he returned to the kitchen when everyone else had gone to bed. He stood in the same place, breathing deeply. The scent was gone now, replaced by the normal must of an old, unused room. But the memory lingered. He looked up at the cupboard where his grandmother had always kept her recipes. He reached up, opened it, and began to search. Behind dusty jars of expired spices and a cracked pepper grinder, he found a battered metal box labeled simply, Recipes. He pulled it down and opened the lid. Inside were index cards in Edith's neat handwriting, each with a title and a list of ingredients. But tucked at the back was something else. A small, leather-bound notebook with a ribbon bookmark. Zachary opened it. The first page was blank. The second had a single line in his grandmother's hand. If you found this, then you've remembered something worth keeping. He turned the page. The next recipe was titled Warm Autumn, and beneath the instructions for a cinnamon apple pie in faded ink was a memory. I made this the day you learned to tie your shoes. You were so proud, you refused to wear anything but sneakers for a week. We ate this on the porch, and you told me I was magic. Maybe I was. Maybe I still am. Zachary closed the book slowly. The scent of apples returned, faint and fleeting, like a whisper on the air. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But for the first time since they had arrived, he whispered to the house. "I remember." And somewhere deep in the old wooden bones of the house, something settled. Something waited. Something smiled. The rain tapered off by morning, leaving behind a glistening hush over the neighborhood. Puddles mirrored the sky, and the scent of wet leaves lingered in the air as the sun struggled to cut through the heavy clouds. In the kitchen, the windows wore a thin mist, and outside the apple tree stood solemnly, its branches bowed with water and time. Zachary sat at the table, the leather-bound notebook open in front of him. He hadn't been able to sleep much after discovering it, his mind spinning with questions that no one was around to answer. The entries inside were dated only by season and memory, not calendar. Each recipe was paired with a brief recollection, as if cooking were not just nourishment, but a method of time travel. There was something sacred in the way his grandmother had written them, not just instructions, but invitations. The second entry in the notebook was titled Summer Whispers. It was a berry cobbler recipe, annotated with a memory of a picnic by the lake, and a story about how Robert, then just a boy, had tried to catch dragonflies with a mason jar. The memory was so vivid in tone, so personal in detail, that Zachary could almost feel the sunburn on his shoulders and the scratch of grass behind his knees. But he hadn't been there. He'd never heard this story before. It wasn't his memory, it was his father's. And yet, somehow reading it made him feel like he had lived it, like the memory had passed to him through the ink. Later that day, when Robert left for town to pick up cleaning supplies, Zachary returned to the kitchen with a plan. He found flour in the pantry, though it was old. There were a few apples in a basket that looked wrinkled but still usable. Butter, sugar, and cinnamon were present in just enough quantities. He lined the pie tin, referencing the recipe titled Warm Autumn from the night before. He followed it step by step, careful not to skip a single note, even the odd instructions, like sing softly while folding in the sugar or tap the side of the bowl 3 times after stirring. They felt silly, almost like superstitions, but he obeyed them with a quiet sense of reverence. As the pie baked, the scent filled the kitchen in waves. It was not the same as the mysterious aroma from the morning before. This was tangible, explainable, the product of real ingredients and heat, but there was still something uncanny about it, as if the scent pulled invisible threads through the house, stitching rooms back together with memory. While it baked, Zachary returned to the recipe notebook and began reading more entries. Each one seemed to bloom with stories. Winter Quiet was a gingerbread recipe tied to a snowstorm that had stranded the family indoors for 2 days, during which time they built a blanket fort that occupied the entire living room. First Spring described lemon scones, and the time Robert brought home a stray kitten, only to pretend he'd found it for Edith when she smiled in that certain way he couldn't resist. The handwriting was always the same, steady, warm, and full of understated affection. Beneath the recipes, sometimes in the margins, were single lines that struck Zachary harder than the memories themselves. Phrases like, "Some tastes outlive the mouths that speak them," or "Love has a flavor. You just have to chew slowly." These were not mere notes. They were her voice, stitched into paper. The oven timer rang out. Zachary opened the door and pulled out the pie, the crust golden and crisp at the edges, the filling bubbling gently through the slits on top. He set it on the windowsill, an act that felt instinctual, though he wasn't sure why. The way the sun hit the glass and cast patterns over the pie felt too familiar, too staged, like the room itself had remembered. When Robert returned and stepped into the kitchen, he froze mid-motion. He stared at the pie and then at Zachary. His expression was unreadable. Without a word, he set down the grocery bag and walked to the sink, pouring himself a glass of water. Zachary didn't speak. He didn't have to. Something was already shifting between them, unspoken, tentative, but real. Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and the kitchen was once again quiet, Zachary slipped back into the living room and sat cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace. The recipe book rested in his lap, and he turned the pages slowly, committing each one to memory. It wasn't just about food. It never had been. This was her way of staying, of resisting absence. He began copying the recipes into a separate notebook of his own, but not verbatim. He added his impressions, what it smelled like, how it felt to read the memory, what he thought his grandmother had been trying to preserve. It was a dialogue between generations, conducted in flour and ink. One entry stood out among the rest. Blackberry Hope, it was titled. The recipe itself was simple, but the note beneath it was peculiar. It read, "This one is for when the dark won't lift. Remember the window that never froze, even in winter." It puzzled Zachary. What window? And why wouldn't it freeze? He made a mental note to look through the house more carefully the next day. He did just that. In the morning, once Robert had gone into town again, Zachary wandered room by room, taking note of the windows. He touched the panes, studied the frames, pressed his forehead against the glass. In the downstairs hallway, next to the closet under the stairs, he found a narrow window that looked out into the side yard. It was clean, unlike the others, and dust hadn't settled on the sill. When he reached out to touch it, he noticed a small chip in the lower corner of the glass, almost invisible unless you leaned in. Beneath the sill was a small metal latch, long rusted. It creaked slightly as he opened it, revealing a hollow space beneath the frame. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. He unfolded it slowly. It was written in the same familiar script. "If you're looking for me, I'm not far. I live between the folds. I rise with the scent of butter, and I hide in the corners of pages. I never wanted to disappear, only to be remembered kindly. If you remember me, then I'm still here." He held the note for a long time, his fingers trembling. He felt the weight of it, not in his hand, but in his chest. That evening, as the light faded and the kitchen dimmed, he lit a single candle and set it on the counter. He didn't bake, he didn't write, he just sat, letting the quiet wrap around him. The house was old, yes, but it wasn't empty. Not anymore. When Robert came in later, he paused at the doorway, watching his son in the flickering light. He didn't ask what Zachary was doing, didn't interrupt. He just leaned against the frame and said something that hung in the air long after. "Smells like her." And Zachary, without turning, nodded. In the days that followed, they began to speak a little more. Not about feelings, not yet, but about practical things, where tools were kept, which rooms needed painting, how to winterize the plumbing. And, in between those conversations, something unspoken threaded itself between their words, shared memory carried quietly. Zachary continued reading the notebook, unlocking memory after memory, baking each one and letting its story fill the walls, and the house, once so silent, began to breathe again. When Sunday came around again, Zachary woke before the sun. He stepped into the kitchen and paused, half expecting the scent to greet him on its own. But there was only stillness. He smiled, reached for the notebook, and opened to the next recipe. This one was titled Mending. And though he hadn't read it yet, he already knew it would taste like something they'd both been needing. Something that wouldn't fix everything, but might just start to. He opened the page, he lit the oven, and he began. The third Sunday since their arrival began as the others had, quiet, gray, and brittle with the early rust of approaching autumn. The sky was thin and colorless, the light outside more suggestion than substance, stretching across the yard like a worn bedsheet. In the kitchen, the air was still, the windows fogged with condensation from the chilly morning air. Zachary awoke with a growing sense of anticipation, though he wasn't entirely sure why. He had not baked anything the night before. He hadn't even stepped into the kitchen after dinner. But something tugged at him as he slid his feet to the floor and reached for the hoodie slung over the bedpost. He walked slowly, listening to the old house breathe. The boards creaked under his step in the hallway, the kind of sound that felt more like memory than noise. When he reached the bottom of the stairs and turned into the kitchen, the scent met him like a whisper at first, gentle and warm, but it grew stronger with every breath. Apples, cinnamon, brown sugar, the unmistakable fragrance of his grandmother's pie. But nothing had been prepared. The counters were as he had left them, bare, wiped clean. The oven was off, cold to the touch. No dishes sat in the sink. No ingredients were out. Yet the smell filled the room with such conviction it felt like it had weight, like it could settle on the furniture and cling to the curtains. Zachary closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, feeling a strange warmth rise in his chest. It was not fear, but something adjacent, something that trembled at the edges of belief. He moved through the house to check, half hoping to find some sign of explanation. A discarded wrapper, an open spice jar, anything. But there was nothing. No rational trail to follow. When he returned to the kitchen, the pie tin was once again sitting on the stovetop. He had put it away himself after washing it the last time. Now it rested there without a trace of flour or filling. Clean, dry, as if waiting. Later that morning, Robert came into the kitchen with a stack of mail and an expression drawn tight with fatigue. He froze briefly when the scent reached him, but he said nothing. Zachary watched him carefully, noting the way his father's gaze lingered on the pie tin before quickly looking away. Instead, Robert reached for the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, and muttered about needing to call the realtor again. Zachary said nothing about the scent, and Robert didn't ask, but the silence between them was filled with it. That afternoon, when Robert drove into town to meet with a potential buyer, Zachary retrieved his notebook, the one in which he had begun copying the recipes, and began cataloging everything he'd experienced since arriving. He created a list of oddities: the scent appearing without cause, the sudden reappearance of kitchen items, the warm tin, the entry in the recipe book that had triggered a memory not his own. Beneath that, he wrote in bold letters, "The house is remembering for us." He wasn't sure why he wrote it that way. It had come unbidden, like something whispered to him in a dream. But once the words were on the page, they didn't feel strange. They felt right, like a key turning. The idea gripped him so tightly that he decided to test it. He searched through the kitchen for a simple recording device. He didn't trust the camera on his phone. It always seemed to miss what mattered most. Instead, he found an old tape recorder in a box in the hall closet, next to a bundle of holiday decorations and a yellowed encyclopedia set. It was bulky and dusty, but when he loaded in fresh batteries and pressed the red button, the tape wheels began to turn with a soft, mechanical hum. That night, Zachary placed the recorder on the kitchen counter and set it to record. He left the room exactly as it was. Nothing baked, nothing disturbed. He didn't even step inside after that, choosing instead to sleep on the living room couch, wrapped in an old quilt that still faintly smelled of lavender and starch. The house remained quiet around him, but he dreamt of movement, of warmth, of the creak of the oven door and the rustle of an apron. He woke several times, heart racing, the air thick with an almost tangible presence. At dawn, he retrieved the recorder. The tape had run for 6 hours. Most of it was empty air, punctuated by the subtle clicks and groans of an old house settling into itself. But at precisely 3:41 a.m., something changed. A faint rustling, then the unmistakable sound of a metal tin being placed gently on a hard surface, a slow scrape, a sigh, and for the briefest moment, low, soft, and close, a woman humming. Zachary listened to the clip over and over, his hands cold and trembling. He wasn't afraid. He was in awe. The sound was not ghostly in the way people often imagined. It was not chilling or violent or distorted. It was soft, present, real. And it did not feel like haunting. It felt like home. He played it once for Robert that evening, not saying anything beforehand. Just let the tape roll. His father listened, expression unchanged at first, but when the humming began, something in his posture faltered. His hand, wrapped around a mug of tea, slackened slightly. He looked away when it ended, then left the room without comment. Zachary sat alone afterward, the air thick with a silence that no longer felt empty, only waiting. The days that followed passed with strange momentum. Robert threw himself into organizing the house, boxing up old linens, scrubbing baseboards, making endless lists of what needed to be done before an open house could be scheduled. But Zachary remained rooted in the kitchen, the recipe book always within reach, his notebook filling quickly with observations, ideas, questions. The scent continued to visit every Sunday without fail, though never at the same time and never for long, always just enough to be noticed, to be remembered. One morning, Zachary noticed something new. A line had appeared in the recipe book that he could swear had not been there before. The ink was faded but fresh in placement. Just beneath the instructions for warm autumn, written in a smaller hand, "Memory rises like steam. Let it settle on the skin before it fades." He touched the words, heart quickening. Was he losing his grip on reality? Or was the house, his grandmother, writing back? He tested the theory. He took a fresh recipe from the book, this one titled River Bread, and followed it precisely. As he kneaded the dough, he thought deliberately of a summer when he had been 7, when Edith had taken him to a creek behind the town library to catch minnows in plastic cups. She had laughed when he slipped and fell, her arms wet as she pulled him up. She had made sandwiches afterward, and they had eaten them by the water, her skirt drying in the breeze. As the bread baked, the scent that filled the kitchen wasn't quite the same as before. It was fuller somehow, layered, carrying notes of something green and warm, like river water and sunlight. When the timer rang and he opened the oven, a memory came unbidden. Not just his own, but hers too. He saw her as a girl, younger than he had ever known her, skipping rocks alone while her own mother called from a distance. He saw her reaching into the water, her fingers grazing something glittering beneath the surface. He felt the memory, like someone else's hand laid gently on his shoulder. He didn't tell Robert that time. Some things weren't ready to be shared, but the moment stayed with him, not just for hours, but days. He began to wonder whether the house wasn't just remembering, but teaching, reconnecting, not haunting its inhabitants, but guiding them back to something they had lost. Not objects, but roots. On the 4th Sunday, the scent was stronger than ever. This time it woke both of them. Zachary came downstairs first and found his father already standing in the kitchen, barefoot, wearing the same expression Zachary imagined he had as a boy lost in a memory. Neither of them spoke. Then Robert did something unexpected. He reached out and lifted the pie tin from the counter. He turned it over in his hands and whispered, so softly that Zachary barely heard, "She used to tap it 3 times before she poured the filling in." Zachary nodded. "That's in the recipe." Robert looked at him, startled, then smiled faintly. The spell, for that moment, was not broken, but shared. In the quiet that followed, Zachary opened the book again and turned to the next page. The recipe was titled Mending. He didn't know yet what it would require, but he knew what it promised. And he was ready. The house had grown quieter, but it was no longer the silence of vacancy. It had become a listening kind of silence, the kind that lingered between walls and waited, attentive and patient. Zachary felt it most in the mornings, before the floorboards stretched beneath footsteps or the kettle hissed with steam. He had begun to treat the space with a kind of reverence, closing doors gently, walking softly in certain rooms as if disturbing the balance might make something delicate disappear. He had spent the week following the third Sunday exploring corners he had never thought to look at before. His grandmother's house, like many old homes, held layers beneath the surface, drawers that stuck until pulled with a certain angle, tiles in the upstairs bathroom that lifted to reveal hollows behind, wooden panels loose enough to suggest secrets. It was a place of impressions more than instructions. The more Zachary followed them, the more he found. On a rainy Tuesday, he started with the attic. It had always been off-limits when he was younger, locked not with a key but with Edith's firm voice and a strict warning about old boards and spider nests. Now the door creaked open with little resistance. Dust curled in the shaft of sunlight that pierced the single window, and the air carried the scent of cedar, dried paper, and something fainter. Lavender, maybe, or some memory of it. Boxes lined the walls, labeled in faded marker. Winter clothes, old toys, school papers. But in the far corner, beneath a worn quilt folded with care, Zachary found a metal tin box with a latch. Inside were cassette tapes, each labeled by hand in his grandmother's script. Most were dated, ranging from the late 80s through the early 2000s, and some bore short titles like Birthday 1994 or Robert's Graduation. But one stood out immediately. It bore no date, only a simple word, Zachary. His hands shook slightly as he picked it up. There was no recorder nearby, but he knew where to find one. The same tape player they used for Christmas carols when he was a child, kept in the hall closet beneath the wrapping paper rolls and burnt-out holiday lights. He found it exactly where he remembered and carried it to the attic, plugging it in with hands that worked more quickly than he expected. The tape crackled to life. For a long moment, there was only static. Then a breath. Then Edith's voice, soft and unhurried. "If you're listening to this, little love, you've probably gone poking through the corners. You always were curious. I hope you're older now. I hope you didn't find this too early. But then again, maybe the house knows better than I do." She paused. Zachary sat cross-legged on the attic floor, unmoving. "I started making these tapes when Robert was small. He didn't care much for letters, but sound leaves something behind. Like steam on a window, you can still see the shape of what was once there. This one, though, is just for you." Another pause, then a warm chuckle. You used to sit on my lap in the kitchen while I stirred batter. You always wanted to help, even when your hands were too small. You'd watch me bake like it was magic, like the oven was a secret portal to something sweet and safe. I guess it was, for a while. And maybe that's what I hope it can still be. Not just a place for food, but for memory, for family, for healing. She talked for a long time, telling stories, some he remembered, some he didn't. She spoke of his mother, whom he'd lost so young he barely remembered her face, of the way she used to braid Zachary's hair while singing, of how she and Edith used to dance in the living room to old jazz records after putting him to bed. She spoke of Robert, of their complicated years, of the quiet arguments and the laughter that always came after. Near the end of the tape, her voice lowered. If you're hearing things, or smelling something sweet when there's no pie in the oven, don't be scared. That's just me. I'm not lost, just layered differently now. Sometimes love settles into the house where it was strongest. Sometimes it needs someone to uncover it. Zachary sat long after the tape ended. The recorders were the only sound in the room. He felt suspended between time and skin, as if someone had peeled back the wallpaper of the world just enough for him to glimpse what lay underneath. That night, when Robert came home late from the hardware store, Zachary said nothing about the attic. He wanted to keep that moment to himself, at least for now. But something had changed between them. His father seemed less distracted, more present, as if something was loosening inside him as well. On Wednesday, Zachary moved to the backyard. The apple tree was still shedding its leaves slowly despite the early frost. Beneath its branches, the ground was damp, the grass flattened from recent rain. He remembered the old wooden bench that used to sit here. Edith had loved to sit beneath the tree with a book in her lap, a cup of tea balanced on the armrest. The bench was gone now, probably taken during an earlier cleaning, but Zachary crouched where it had been and began to dig. It wasn't a methodical search. He didn't expect anything. He didn't know what he was looking for, but after just a few minutes his fingers hit something solid. A small wooden box, its corners reinforced with tarnished brass. It wasn't buried deep, just below the surface, as if someone had wanted it to be found, but not accidentally. Inside was a necklace, delicate and handmade from old buttons and string. He remembered it vaguely, something Edith had made with him when he was 5 or 6. It had always been too fragile to wear, so she had kept it hanging on the kitchen corkboard. Beneath the necklace was a folded napkin, pale blue, with a single word stitched into the corner in red thread. Begin. Zachary turned it over in his hands. It wasn't a message with instructions. It was a whisper. He returned to the kitchen and opened the recipe book again. As he flipped to the next page, a note in the margin caught his eye. Begin where the thread is weakest. That's where the fabric will tear or mend. The next recipe was titled First Fray. It was simple, just sugar cookies with orange zest and nutmeg, but the story attached to it was longer than usual. It described a fight between Edith and Robert back when he was 16, just days before he left the house for good. It spoke of angry words and doors slammed, of silence that lasted weeks, and of a single afternoon when she had baked a batch of cookies and left them on the porch, knowing he might walk by. He hadn't taken one, but he had paused. She had seen him from the window. Zachary read the story twice. Then he made the cookies. He didn't ask his father to join. He simply placed the plate on the porch and waited. Robert found them an hour later. He didn't say anything when he stepped into the kitchen holding the half-empty plate. He just set them down on the counter and looked at Zachary for a long moment. You found her tapes, he said quietly. Zachary nodded. I didn't know she made one for you. Zachary hesitated. Did she make one for you? Robert's expression shifted, softening. She left me a letter, he said. I read it once, then I put it away. I didn't think I deserved to read it again. Zachary reached for the recipe book and turned it to first fray. He handed it to his father without a word. Robert read it slowly. Then he closed the book and sat down at the table. I should have come home sooner. You're home now, Zachary said. That night, the kitchen stayed warm long after the oven had cooled, and upstairs the recipe book waited, open to the next page where the title was written in trembling ink, Forgiveness. And in the corner, in tiny handwriting, a new message had appeared. Now that you've begun, don't stop. The days that followed felt heavy with a strange kind of waiting, the kind where no one said aloud what they hoped for, but everything they did seemed to lean toward it. Zachary noticed the shift most in the quiet moments, when Robert lingered longer over his coffee in the morning, when he left doors open instead of shutting them behind him, when his footsteps didn't echo with the same urgency through the old hallway. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. But after years of silence, even subtle things could feel like revelations. Outside, the season had begun to tip toward late autumn. Leaves had gathered in damp piles across the backyard, the apple tree now nearly bare. The air had that thin, metallic bite that promised frost by nightfall. Zachary had started keeping a fire going in the living room when he could, letting the scent of burning wood and the crackle of flame fill the evenings with warmth. One morning, while Robert was out meeting with the real estate agent again, though less enthusiastically now, Zachary returned to the attic with a sense of purpose. He carried with him the notebook, the recipe book, and a flashlight, even though daylight spilled in weakly through the tiny round window. The attic, with its quiet dust and time-stained edges, felt more like a chapel than a storage room now. Each visit made it feel more intentional, as though Edith herself had carved out this space, not just for things, but for remembering. He sat cross-legged near the same place where he had found the tapes and began to sort through a smaller pile of unmarked boxes. Most were filled with photos, some in albums, some loose in envelopes, some curled at the edges with age. He spread a few out before him and was struck by the way people could look familiar and foreign at once. His father, as a young man, caught mid-laugh in a black and white print. Edith in a sundress at a lakeside, a younger woman than he had ever seen her, smiling with eyes closed, her hands in the air as if dancing. In some of the oldest photos, there were people he didn't recognize at all. Neighbors, perhaps, or long-gone family. At the bottom of one box was a sealed envelope, yellowed and bound with twine. His name was written across it, not in the flowing script of the recipe book, but more deliberate, slower, as though each letter had been given great care. He hesitated before opening it. The weight of knowing, even the anticipation of knowing, can sometimes feel heavier than the knowing itself. Inside were 2 sheets of paper and a photograph. The first page was a letter, not a long one, not full of metaphors or riddles like her recipes, just clear, gentle words in her voice. Zachary, if you're reading this, I hope it means you're still curious. I hope it means you've stayed long enough to ask questions that no one else wanted to. You were always watching, even when people thought you were distracted. You see things others miss. I want to tell you something I never told your father, not because I didn't trust him, but because he wasn't ready. I hope you are. There's a reason this house remembers. It isn't just me. It's everyone who came before us. Everyone who loved here, fought here, forgave here. I didn't grow up in a house like that. This one I built with care, with ritual, with repetition. That's what Bacon was to me, repetition with purpose, like prayer. When your father left, it wasn't just anger, it was grief. He lost someone before he lost me, someone we don't talk about, someone I failed to hold on to, too. Ask him about the letter I never mailed. If he reads it now, maybe something can still grow. The photograph was a picture of Edith, Robert, and a young woman standing between them. The woman had short dark hair, a nervous smile, and a pregnant belly. On the back, a single name was written, Miriam. Zachary stared at the photo for a long time. He had never heard that name before. He found the box again, where Edith had kept old papers, and after some time he uncovered another envelope, this one addressed to Robert but never sent. Inside was a letter written in the same hand, though shakier, longer, more emotional. He read it only once. Then he put it back. That evening, as twilight crept in like ink and water, Zachary found his father in the shed sorting through tools. Robert looked up when Zachary entered, his hands dusty, his eyes tired. "I found a letter you were meant to have," Zachary said. Robert stilled. His eyes dropped to the floor, then to Zachary's hands. Without speaking, he held out his palm. Zachary gave him the letter and left him alone. The silence in the house that night was not the tense kind. It was weighty, full of reflection. Robert did not speak at dinner. He went to bed early, the letter folded and kept in his shirt pocket. The next morning, the air was crisp and bright. Zachary woke to the sound of something different, metal scraping against stone. He looked out the window and saw Robert in the backyard, clearing leaves from the base of the apple tree. He worked methodically, as though each leaf mattered. Later that afternoon, they stood together in the kitchen. Robert took the recipe book from the counter and opened it to a marked page. The title was Forgiveness. He looked at Zachary, then at the ingredients. "I haven't made this since before you were born," he said. They baked together in silence. The recipe was simple: ginger, clove, lemon peel, a dark molasses crust, but the instructions were written in a different tone than the others. There were pauses in the language, soft suggestions instead of commands. "Let this one take time. Don't rush. Forgiveness doesn't rise like bread. It seeps in like broth." They measured, mixed, shaped, and waited. The oven's warmth filled the kitchen slowly, and when the scent emerged, spicy, earthy, nostalgic, Zachary felt his throat tighten. They sat together at the table with 2 slices on mismatched plates. Robert took a bite and exhaled through his nose, closing his eyes. "I remember this taste," he said. "She made it when I came home from the hospital, after Miriam." Zachary didn't ask. He waited. Robert looked out the window, and his face softened by light and memory. "She was my sister, my twin. She died when we were 20. I didn't know how to carry that grief. I pushed everyone away, even Mom. She tried, but she didn't know how to speak about it. And I didn't know how to listen." He shook his head slowly. "Then I lost your mom. Not in the same way, but lost stacks. It makes you hard." Zachary reached for his notebook and opened to a blank page. He didn't write anything, but he laid his pen down beside it. An invitation, not a command. Robert saw it. He nodded. "Maybe we don't sell the house," he said quietly. Zachary smiled. He reached for the recipe book and turned to the next page. It was titled Staying, and in the margin, again, a line had appeared that neither of them had written. "Now you can begin again, without forgetting." The recipe had been written in shakier script than the rest. The title, Forgiveness, arched across the top of the yellowing page like a banner hung too long in the sun. Some of the letters were faint, as if they'd faded faster than others, or as if the pen had hesitated while forming them. The paper itself was softer in texture, its edges curled like an autumn leaf. There was no memory scrawled beneath the ingredients this time, no anecdote about laughter or loss, or a moment folded into pastry. Just the list, simple and precise. But Zachary knew immediately that this one was different. He stood with the book open, the morning light pushing in through the kitchen window in slanted beams. The air carried the ghost of last night's baking, molasses and citrus still clinging faintly to the walls. The silence wasn't tense now, nor was it mournful. It was reverent, filled with a sense of anticipation, as if the house, too, was waiting. Robert entered the kitchen quietly, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his flannel shirt half-buttoned and uneven. He paused when he saw the book open on the counter. "Is that the one?" he asked. Zachary nodded. She called it Forgiveness. No story, just the steps. Robert stepped closer, reading over his son's shoulder. He reached out and lightly ran his fingers across the page, then looked down at the list. Flour, brown sugar, nutmeg, black tea, lemon peel, butter, honey, a pinch of salt. It didn't seem unusual, no stranger than anything else in the book, but there was something in the way it was written, in the way the ingredients were spaced, in the faint underlining of the final word, as if she'd meant to leave a thread there for someone to follow. Without speaking, they began to gather what they needed. The kitchen was colder than usual, the late October wind outside making the floorboards groan under its pressure. But inside, the stove's orange glow was beginning to stretch across the linoleum, and as the ingredients came together, the kitchen slowly warmed. The recipe instructed them to brew the tea first, letting it steep for 10 minutes with thin slices of lemon, then mix it into the dry ingredients slowly, kneading the dough by hand until smooth. The flour dusted the air like memory, catching the sunlight as it swirled. Robert rolled up his sleeves and worked the dough in silence. Zachary prepared the baking sheet, lining it with parchment as the tea cooled in a ceramic bowl once used for fruit. When it came time to roll out the dough and cut it into circles, Robert paused, staring at the soft mound in his hands. "I remember this feeling," he said finally. "I never thought I would. The way she worked the dough, how she let me help when I was small. She never said anything while we baked. She just watched." Zachary didn't reply. He simply handed his father the rolling pin. Once the shapes were cut and placed on the sheet, they moved together to the oven, like two ends of a thread drawing closer with every pass. The timer was set. 12 minutes. The scent began to rise at 8. It wasn't just sweet. It was deep, earthy, complex, with something sharp at its core. The honey curled into the brown sugar, the nutmeg offered a quiet warmth, and the lemon broke through like a cord of light. As they waited, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Something passed between them now that didn't require words. It was in the ritual, in the repetition, in the way Robert reached to open the oven exactly when the timer beeped, as if he had done it 1,000 times in another life. The cookies cooled on the rack in silence. Robert broke one open, the steam curling up like breath. He inhaled deeply and then handed it to Zachary. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight painting soft gold on the wood between them, and ate. It wasn't just a cookie. It wasn't even just a memory. It was a reckoning. Robert set his half down after a few bites and looked toward the window. The apple tree had finally shed all its leaves. The branches stood black and bare against the silver sky. "I dreamed about her last night," he said, not turning away from the glass. "She was here, in this kitchen. She wasn't old, like when she died. She was younger than me. She was kneading bread, and I was standing where you are now. She didn't speak, but she smiled. That same smile from the old photo albums, like she knew something I didn't." Zachary listened without interrupting. "She never blamed me," Robert went on. "Not for leaving, not for not coming back sooner, not even for forgetting the smell of this house. But I blame myself. All these years, and it wasn't guilt I felt, it was shame. Shame doesn't forgive the way guilt does. It just hardens." Zachary reached for another cookie and took a slow bite. Did the dream feel like a memory? Robert turned to face him, eyes tired but clear. No, it felt like permission. Later that day, they went through the rest of the attic boxes together. They found a few more photos, another tape labeled simply Autumn, and a recipe card that had fallen behind the dresser, marked with a dried flower pressed between its pages. Zachary would copy the card later, adding it to his own book. He'd begun keeping it separately now, a growing archive of old and new, recipes that remembered and the ones that were still being written. That evening, as the sky turned the color of ash, Robert returned from a walk with a small cardboard box. Inside were daffodil bulbs and 2 small oak saplings. He didn't explain where he had gone or why he'd chosen those. He just carried them out into the yard, gloves in one hand and shovel in the other, and waited for Zachary. They planted the saplings near the far edge of the property, where the grass sloped gently toward the neighbor's fence. Zachary placed one of the daffodil bulbs beside the roots. The other he handed to Robert, who accepted it without hesitation. When they were finished, the soil was dark and fresh, the smell of earth sharp in the air. "I'm not going back," Robert said suddenly. "To the realtor, to the plans I made before." Zachary looked at him. "You're staying?" Robert nodded. "This house still has things to teach me, and I don't want to forget any more of them." That night, the kitchen was filled with the soft hum of music from an old radio, the warmth of another fire in the hearth, and the scent of a recipe that neither of them had known before that week, but would never forget now. They sat in the living room, father and son, each holding a cup of tea, not looking at one another, but still entirely together. Zachary opened the recipe book one last time before sleep and found the next page already waiting for him. It had no title yet, just a blank line and a smudge of ink at the bottom. But in the corner, there was a message in his grandmother's careful script. "Once you learn the flavor of healing, you will crave nothing less." And just beneath that, smaller, like a whisper, "Keep writing." So he would. By the time the first frost held the yard in its quiet grasp, the house had begun to sound different. Not in the creak of floorboards or the whisper of drafts through weathered windows, but in the way the sounds of living had returned to it. The house, once filled with echoes of what used to be, now pulsed again with a present noise. Drawers opened and shut with purpose. The kettle whistled each morning, and a soft murmur of voices, sometimes in conversation, sometimes just breath passing between rooms, filled the long hallways. There was a rhythm now, a pulse. Zachary could feel it in his chest whenever he woke. He no longer crept cautiously through the rooms. He walked freely. His hands instinctively reached for bowls and spoons and measuring cups without checking instructions. He had internalized the language of the kitchen, not just as a skill, but as a memory made physical. The scent of rising bread no longer felt like a message from someone lost, but an offering from someone returned, not in body, perhaps, but in spirit. And through every recipe he brought to life, he felt more tethered to the people who had shaped the home before him. The saplings they planted behind the fence had rooted well. Even under the cold soil, they stood steady, leaves already gone but their spines strong against the wind. Every morning, Zachary passed them on the way to the compost heap, his breath clouding the air. He sometimes touched the bare branches with gloved fingers and whispered the name of a recipe aloud, as though the trees were listening. Inside the house, Robert had taken to writing again. Not poetry or memoirs, but small note cards he tucked into drawers. Notes that read things like, "Don't forget to watch the sky tonight," or "Apples are best in early November," or "You're not alone, even in silence." Zachary found them in the oddest places. Beneath a jar of cloves stuck to the inside of the refrigerator, tucked inside the front cover of a book he hadn't opened in years. It was his father's quiet way of speaking now, no longer with avoidance or distance, but with a gentleness that required no acknowledgement. They never formally decided not to sell the house. No contract was torn in two, no dramatic speeches made. The decision simply dissolved, like sugar into tea. Boxes, once prepared for storage, were quietly unpacked. Curtains, once taken down, were rehung. The guest bedroom became Robert's study. The front porch, once empty and brittle, now held 2 chairs and a woven blanket, always folded neatly in the corner. One night, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, Robert brought down a photograph album from the attic. It was larger than the others Zachary had seen. Bound in worn leather and etched faintly with gold along the edges, it had the weight of something sacred. They sat together on the couch, flipping through the pages slowly. Many of the photos were new to Zachary, snapshots of a younger Robert and Edith, moments of everyday life, gardening, laughing, holding plates of food with pride. But the deeper they went, the more familiar faces appeared. Zachary saw himself as a toddler in his grandmother's arms, saw his mother, young, vibrant, holding him close in the backyard where the apple tree now stood stripped of its leaves. One photo made him pause longer than the others. It was a candid shot, slightly blurry, of Edith at the stove, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding a wooden spoon mid-stir. Her head was turned, laughing at something off-frame. The light through the window had caught in her hair, and the warmth of the room seemed to bleed right through the photo paper. Zachary ran his finger across the image, tracing the curve of her cheek, the edge of the mixing bowl beside her. "I want to hang this in the kitchen," he said softly. Robert nodded. The next morning, he found a frame already waiting for him on the table. They hung the photo beside the pantry door. Not in the center of the wall, not above the stove where steam might blur it, but in a quiet corner where one might see it only if standing still. It became a kind of altar, not of worship, but of remembering. Zachary touched the frame lightly every time he passed it, and over time, he stopped noticing how often he did it. It simply became part of the way he moved through the house. When the snow came, gentle at first, then in heavy drifts, it transformed the yard into a muted world. The saplings stood like sentinels, and the apple tree, though skeletal, looked almost luminous in the morning frost. Zachary baked more in the winter months. Not always the recipes from the book, sometimes his own, sometimes experiments with flavors Edith had never written down. He began keeping a new book. a blank journal he filled page by page with not only ingredients and steps, but with reflections, sketches, and words that drifted into his head as the dough rose or cooled. He titled the book quietly on the front page, Second Batch. Robert read it once a week, sometimes making suggestions in the margins in pencil. They began to speak of the idea of sharing the recipes more broadly, not publishing, not in a traditional way, but offering them as stories to others. Stories you could taste. Stories that might help someone else remember, or stay, or heal. In January, Zachary offered to host a baking afternoon for a few of the neighbors. Some he remembered vaguely from childhood. Others were new to him. He expected 4 people. 11 came. Some brought ingredients. Others brought photographs or old family recipes of their own. One woman, Mrs. Chang, arrived with a faded card in Chinese characters and asked if he could help her adapt it to American ingredients. By the end of the afternoon, the house smelled of cinnamon, sesame, and citrus. Every window fogged with steam. Laughter rose louder than the mixer. Flour dusted the floor. Robert stood at the edge of the dining room watching his son with quiet pride, his arms crossed, his eyes soft. Zachary later wrote down every detail from that day. He included a new recipe, remembrance cookies. It used 5 different spices from 5 different neighbors and was topped with a glaze made of honey and tea, his grandmother's eternal combination. He added a final line to the page. This house remembers everyone who steps through the door. Bake with care. By spring, the daffodils had begun to emerge around the base of the trees. Then green shoots at first, then the delicate, nodding blooms of bright yellow against the mud and old leaves. The neighbors began dropping by more frequently. Some brought stories, some brought silence, and both were welcome. On the first warm afternoon of April, Robert took down the camera from the closet. The old one, the one that had once captured birthday parties and holidays. He dusted it off, replaced the batteries, and handed it to Zachary. "We haven't taken a real photo in this house in years," he said. They posed in the yard near the apple tree. Zachary stood with one hand on the small oak sapling, his other arm slung around Robert's shoulders. The daffodils blurred slightly in the background. The house loomed gently behind them, no longer somber, but solid. When the photo was printed, they placed it in a frame beside Edith's near the pantry. 2 corners of memory, watching over the kitchen like old friends. Weeks later, Zachary stood at the counter preparing a new recipe, one that hadn't existed until that day. It involved brown sugar, thyme, and orange zest, an odd combination that had come to him while watching rain fall against the porch roof. He wrote it down slowly, testing each step, adjusting as he moved. When he reached the final line, he paused. For the first time in months, he added a note beneath the instructions. "I don't know who this is for yet, but if you're reading this, then you've already begun." And somewhere in the quiet hush of the house, beneath the humming pipes and the ticking clock, it felt, for just a moment, as though someone had whispered back, "Well done." The scent of the new recipe filled the kitchen like promise, and the home, now fully awake again, breathed it in with gratitude. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Check out the next chapter or explore other stories on the channel. There's so much more waiting for you. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a little hope today.